is something that Weber talked about. So we're getting to a very last part here of our time together, and for me to say a few things about Max Weber. Religion for him is oriented towards this world. Religious ideas and behaviors can be seen in sort of everyday conduct. Weber is most well known in terms of talking about religion to sort of link changes that happen within the religious sphere and the impact that it had, for example, on the emergence of a new economic way of thinking, which is capitalism. He wrote about the Protestant ethic and how it has contributed to the rise of capitalism. Specifically, he was writing about an aspect of the Protestant Reformation, a group called the Calvinists, who believed that some of them were predestined to go to heaven, predestined by God. In order to demonstrate this predestination, they started to live these very moral lives, working very hard and spending none of their money. It was seen as a sin to engage in luxury or engage in idleness. So according to Weber, that sort of approach to life led to the accumulation of sort of capital and was a contributing factor to the rise of capitalism. Weber argued that ideas, whether true or false, they represent a person's definition of reality, and they have a potential to influence behavior. And the Protestant ethic was sort of his main example of that. So he wrote, and that has a huge impact for sociologists, because he wrote that in order to interpret actions, we need to understand the actor's motives. That's what's called Vestehen. And researchers should place themselves in the roles of those that are being studied in order to be able to understand why they did what they did. Comparative and historical studies of religion, Weber actually was quite a prolific writer about religion. One of the other impacts or contribution from his work is that conceptions of gods were strongly, he found, related to economic, social, and political conditions in which people live. That means that how we understand God, what shapes he or she takes, and a long time ago more she, and then over time that transformed into a he, from female gods to male gods, or the gods of the conquered being merged with the gods of the conquerors. Weber looked at the relationship between the two. Now, there are some criticism of his work, and mostly criticism of how his work has been taken up. More recent writing has talked about how the correlation between this Protestant ethic and the rise of capitalism may be weaker than Weber said it was. And we know that by being involved with sociologists and others are looking at the emergence of capitalism in places where the Protestant ethic wasn't there, and in places where there was what you would describe as Protestant ethic, not leading to a flourishing capitalism. But the other criticism is that this notion that ideas can have profound influence on people's behavior and lead to social change, people who followed up in Weber's step have made that a more causal, a more simple explanation of what Weber was talking about. And so what's known as the Protestant ethic thesis hasn't been applied as carefully as Weber did. So what we have is we have religion that's really important aspect of the world historically, but right now in the contemporary world. There's lots of different ways in which we understand that, as demonstrated by the different sort of definitions that you came up with, and as we talked about a little bit of sort of typology. Religion plays an important role in the world state, but also still sort of in Canada and shaping institutions and kind of relationships that we have. Wanted to give an overview or an introduction into what are the kinds of things that sociologists of religion are interested in, and then end my time by talking a little bit about some of the differences in those theoretical perspectives of Durkheim, Marx, and Weber as it pertains to religion. And their most lasting contribution is to allow us as sociologists to understand religion and its link to social solidarity, understand the link between religion and social conflict, and study and understand the link between religion and social change. So I think that's my time this afternoon. I never spoke to this many individuals at one time, so I want to thank you for your patience and for your attention, and for Professor Gray and Professor Brin to give me this opportunity. So enjoy the rest of it.
Well, is that even going to sit down?
Yeah.
Wow.
What?
Especially if it's thing like that.
All right, thank you, Professor Karen, for that.
Except you left.
I'm going to pick up on a few of the themes that Professor Karen briefly mentioned and expand on them a bit. And I want to start first with the question about why people are religious. This is a sort of a burning sociological question, and Professor Karen hit on a few aspects of it, but I want to go a little further. And to do that, I'm going to read two quotes to you. I'll put them up here as well, that I think are particularly interesting. So let's start with William James from 1902. Religion is a common human response to the fact that we all stand at the edge of an abyss. It helps us cope with the terrifying fact that we must die. It offers us immortality, the promise of better times to come, and the security of benevolent spirits who look over us. It provides meaning and purpose in a world that might otherwise seem cruel and senseless. So I think that's a pretty powerful statement about the status of the human condition and the implicit vulnerability that we all must feel if we think about issues around mortality and the very meaning of life and why we're here. And in that sense, it kind of makes sense that human beings would want to think about and construct a sort of a broader design in religion. I'm going to return now to Marx, because of course this is such a famous quotation, and if you want to sound smart at any cocktail party, you'll need to memorize this. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. It is the opium of the people. That's your opening line at the cocktail party. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is required for their real happiness. So now Marx invokes politics here. Right? The demand to give up the illusion about its condition is the demand to give up a condition which needs illusions. So that's worth thinking about quite a bit. And of course, as Professor Karen mentioned, it's representative of Marx's general thesis of advancing the conflict school within sociology. And it underscores a very critical point that Marx and others make about religion and the economy. And his argument, which we touched on it before, but let me expand it, is that particularly the poor and the disenfranchised are drawn to religion. They're drawn to religion like a drug, like opium, in order to anesthetize themselves from their very painful social and economic conditions. And it was precisely this anesthetic effect of religion that was particularly troubling for Marx. Because under this anesthetic of the promise of an afterlife, and of the idea of maybe being in heaven, maybe there would be 7 virgins waiting for you. Whatever afterlife story that religion may come with, if you invest in that, then you may invest less in improving the conditions of the present. So in a sense, the anesthetic properties of religion, like any drug, might dull your sense of precisely how oppressed you are in the present, how poor you are, how disenfranchised you are. And in that sense, Marx worried that maybe religion is deeply pacifying. Because if we put all of our eggs in the afterlife basket, then we care less about what happens here, and we may be less likely to try to create change in the here and now, political change, economic change. Now, as for God in general, in the West, we see a move towards secularization. That is, people are becoming increasingly beholden to religious ideas. Nevertheless, the belief in God still exists in our lives. It's still quite prevalent in our society. It's manifest throughout our culture. And in fact, many believe that God controls the events of our lives, even if they're not themselves deeply religious, meaning they're not necessarily attending church every week. They nevertheless would feel that God has some control over their daily experience. Some people see this in broader terms. Maybe God has control over natural disasters, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis. Maybe God has something to do with your stock portfolio. Maybe God has something to do with whether the Raptors win or not, right? So, in these formulations, apparently God has a lot of time on his hands to intervene in even the most daily and trivial aspects of our lives. And moreover, many believe that if they have very good fortune, that is in some way a sign of God's will. So let's say if you're the only survivor in a car accident, you might say, God protected me. Thank God that I survived. I survived because of God's good grace. This is what we call in sociology the divine control thesis. So our own Professor Sheeman here at the University of Toronto, with others, writes that individuals who sustain a belief in divine control perceive God to have a determinative influence in their lives, both good and bad outcomes. So that God, in a sense, has decided what our lives should be and the fate that we all will ultimately encounter. Now, in North American society, belief in God is pervasive, and it influences everything from contemporary politics to gender relations and to policy in general. So as an example, often leaders will thank God for their candidacy if they win an election. In the last U.S. presidential election, Joe Biden prefaced his vice presidential plans with the words, God willing, meaning Biden expects to be vice president only if God wills it to be so. Now, across time and place, this divine control thesis invokes many different kinds of representations of God. God is believed to be, the master, the father, maybe the great mother, maybe our friend, maybe our savior, maybe our healer. Orthodox Christians, for instance, believe that God desires a very special connection with each individual and will commonly intercede in our lives. So there's this concept within the divine control thesis of a personal relationship, that individuals have personal relationships with God and have a sort of direct line of communication one way or another. And in that sense, there's this idea that God is very human-like, right? God is sort of out there, omnipotent, all-knowing, and all-powerful, and able to intervene in any way in our lives as he or she or it sees fit. So there's this notion that God is a causal agent with commanding authority over our lives and over history. And this is pretty common across most major religions. So as I alluded to at the beginning of the lecture, one question for sociology is why people are religious in the first place and how religiosity varies across society. Now, one of the major contributions of sociology on this question is to consider the effects of socioeconomic status on religious belief. So SES, a term you surely know by now, refers to socioeconomic status. It usually includes a measure of one's income and also the degree of education that they attained. So there are two major arguments within sociology about why people are more or less religious. And I'm going to review both now. The first is this deprivation compensation thesis. So this thesis tells us that individuals who are disadvantaged socioeconomically are more likely to be religious in order to compensate for their deprivation. Now, something interesting to note here, this thesis is quite close to Marx's idea about religion being an opiate of the masses. Both the deprivation compensation thesis and Marx suggest that People rely upon an omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing deity as a way to kind of buffer or offset the very depressing and worrisome psychological effects of adversity, of poverty, of illness, of marginality. Social structural problems that individuals have a hard time overcoming by themselves. Those are the kinds of problems, the kinds of deprivation that lead people to, according to this thesis, to believe in God. Now, empirically, there is some evidence that confirms that low SES, so low socioeconomic status, individuals are more likely to seek God through prayer, and they tend to report higher levels of divine interaction. They feel greater connections with God, and they more often hold the belief that God indeed does control life events. So there is empirically a connection between socioeconomic status and religiosity. Moreover, it's also found that people of low socioeconomic status tend to derive greater benefits from religiosity than those who are more educated. Now, one classic example of this is the AfricanAmerican Church. In the U.S., the church has historically occupied a very important position in the black community. It's been of central importance, and in part, the idea is that African Americans have been politically and economically marginalized in a way that fits very well into the deprivation compensation thesis. And so the church became a center of solace and a sense of community building for black Americans in the last century or more. Now, the second alternative thesis to deprivation compensation is the demythologization thesis. So the demythologization thesis holds that higher socioeconomic status diminishes the belief in the supernatural. In other words, the more wealthy you become and the more educated you become, the less likely you are to be religious. That is, you move from the sacred to the secular. And non-religious explanations of daily life become more common. So here the idea is that individuals with more education and more wealth feel greater sense of control and power in their own lives. And as a consequence of that feeling of self-control, they tend to apply more rational ideas about why the world is the way it is, and they tend to look more to observable forces rather than the supernatural to explain their daily lives. So unlike the deprivation compensation view, that first theory, this theory provides an explanation for why high socioeconomic status folks would not profess the same kinds of levels of belief in divine involvement as their lower SES peers. Now, of course, think about it, these two theories can work together. They're certainly not mutually exclusive. They both, in fact, may be true. Okay, so I want to talk now about the divine control thesis, this idea that God controls every aspect of our lives. And I want to talk about it more in terms of your own experience. And I want to do that through the idea of prayer. Because prayer, if you think about it, is one of the ways of calling up God, if you will, and asking God to help you, to help change something in your life. And so that implicitly then reflects the divine control thesis. Because if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and if God can change the events and circumstances of your life, then prayer becomes one of the vehicles to sort of make that happen. I wonder how many of you, how many folks in your generation have prayed for things in your life. So we'll do a little informal poll. Give me a yay if you have ever prayed for God to intervene in some aspect of your life. Yay. Give me a nay if you have never prayed for God to intervene in any aspect of your life. Okay. So we have a few more yays than nays. You're probably all praying for the class to end. God is busy, and from Convocation Hall, there's a lot of phone calls coming in. Okay, here's another question. I want a yay if you believe that prayer can make a change in the real world. Can prayer make a change in the real world? Yay. All right. Now, let's hear a nay if you do not believe that prayer can make a change in the real world. Nay. All right, so I don't know. I think it's maybe about 50-50 right here. Okay, well, what does sociology tell us about this? Now, let me preface this part of the lecture again by saying it's really not the role of sociology to tell you if God exists or not. But nevertheless, sociologists can study certain aspects of religiosity and their effects. So one of the things that we can study and think about is prayer. What are the effects of prayer? So a few years back, Dr. Herbert Benson, who's a cardiologist at a large medical institute in Boston. This dude managed to get $2 million together and did a study designed to test if, in fact, prayer can facilitate healing. And here's how the experiment went. There were 1,802 patients, 6 different hospitals, all of whom had just received coronary bypass surgery. Okay, so 1,802 patients, 6 hospitals, they all had the same procedure, coronary bypass surgery. Okay, so heart surgery. Now the patients were divided into 3 groups. Group 1 received prayers, but they didn't know they were receiving prayers. Group 2 received no prayers, but they didn't know it. So they're just patients in the hospital, no prayers, didn't know one way or the other. Group 3 received prayers, and they knew it. Okay, so really, group 1 and 3 are the same, with the difference that group 1 did not know they were being prayed for, group 3 did know they were being prayed for. Okay, and group 2 received no prayers at all. So now you'll notice that the structure of this experiment allowed the researchers to determine if the effect of prayer, if there was any, was a consequence of the prayer itself, or is it a consequence of simply the knowledge that you're being prayed for? You notice the difference there. So if simply just the knowledge that you're being prayed for can produce a change, that's kind of a placebo effect, if you will, rather than just being prayed for and not knowing it, and getting some help out of it. Okay, so if prayer has an effect on health because of the prayer itself, then group 1 and 3 should have roughly the same outcome because they were both prayed for. But if prayer has an effect on health because of the knowledge that you're being prayed for, then we will expect only group 3 would show an improvement in health. So here's how the prayers went. Somewhere else, a group of people got together, and they were given the names of the 1,802 sick patients. And they were given a script that they had to recite every day. And the script went like this: I am praying for a successful surgery with a quick, healthy recovery and no complications for John Becker. Right? So they went through all the names of the people who, in fact, were being prayed for, and they read the script, meaning there was a standardization of the prayer. So everyone was praying for the same thing, right? So God was getting the same message over and over. There was no variability in the message itself. So I give this study to you actually because it's one of the biggest of its kind and the most systematic to measure the effects of prayer. It was done in 2006 or 2005 maybe. The results were reported in the American Heart Journal in April 2006. If you're interested in it, you can see the citation at the bottom of that slide. So here's what they found, all right? Among the two groups who did not know that they were being prayed for, whereby one group was actually prayed for and one was not, there was no difference in rates of complication due to the surgery. In other words, those patients who were prayed for did not do any better in recovering from the surgery than those patients who were not prayed for. However, comparing the two groups who were prayed for, one group who knew it and the other who did not know it, there was a difference. There was a difference. But in the opposite direction than you might expect. In fact, complications occurred in 59% of patients who were certain of receiving the prayer on their behalf, compared to only 52% of patients who were in fact getting the prayer but didn't know it. In other words, knowing that you're prayed for actually worsened the outcome, not improved it. I would think those sleeping in the front row would be excited about this finding. Oh man, this is really good stuff here. So this is a very interesting study. Now, let's poke some holes in it. Now that I've thoroughly depressed you about the power of prayer. For one thing, some argue that prayer has to be done maybe in closer proximity. Maybe prayer has to be done with photographs of the actual person. Maybe God needs a more powerful visual image. Maybe prayer needs to be done by those who are relatives of those who are sick, because the prayer then would involve seemingly more emotion. You get more emotion if your dad is dying as you're praying than you do for just some person's name that you have a personal connection to. So in that sense, perhaps the study is flawed. I leave that up to you to consider. Okay, moving forward a bit, I want to talk now about religious extremism. It's such a hot topic today for obvious reasons. I'm going to sort of stay away from the most obviously political aspects, since you sort of see that every day. But I want to discuss other things in part around religious extremism, things that you may not have considered. First, we should talk about, so what is religious extremism? You think you know, but you may not. Religious extremism is a term used to describe the actions or ideologies of religious individuals or groups outside the perceived center of a given religion. And that's key there, outside the perceived center of a given religion. So what does this mean? Does being a suicide bomber in the name of a particular religion, is that an act of religious extremism? Being a suicide bomber? What do you think?
What?
Yes. Any no's? No. Yes. Well, maybe. The answer depends on the general consensus of the religious group that you're looking at. If the religious group that you're looking at holds suicide bombing as a common practice and a common value, as a way of achieving a given end in the world, then it would not be considered a religious extremism. It's part of the center of the religion. So religious extremism is not relative to your absolute standard of what makes something extreme or not. Religious extremism is relative to the particular religious group and their value system that you're looking at. So in that sense, if you have a religious group that holds that suicide bombing is a valid way of enacting God's will, and there's a common consensus around that within a given religious group, then suicide bombing is in fact not an act of religious extremism. It's certainly extreme. And certainly from our Canadian, Western, Judeo-Christian standards, it would be extreme. It's not necessarily the case, a representation of religious extremism. So that's the key with religious extremism. Keep it in mind.